Hello and welcome back. Sleepy What's It here with another miniatures video for you. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look on how you can use Zenithal Undercoat combined with contrast paints to achieve a tabletop quality mini using speed painting on easy mode. So as I mentioned in the cold open, we're going to be taking a look at using our undercoat and contrast paints to quickly achieve a good quality mini with little effort. The formal name for this technique is Ingrise, though I've also heard of it referred to as sketch painting. Though I'm going to be using contrast paints in this video from GW, the same effect can be achieved using any highly pigmented translucent paint, so things like an artistic ink or standard miniature paint thinned using a glazing medium. I would suggest staying away from using a shade or wash paint, because though they do have the translucence that we need, their tendency to flow down into the recesses and details and not tint higher areas is somewhat problematic, and they also suffer from tending not to be particularly pigment dense. You can use them, though this requires many thin layers to build up the colors to avoid a very desaturated look. In this video, we're going to be painting some mini-tars from Reaper's Bones line. I believe these were originally part of their Bones 4 Kickstarter, but are available from their store now. If you're wanting to follow along, these specific minis aren't really essential to the process I'm going to be showing, and something like Beastmen from Games Workshop would be very appropriate for this paint scheme, and you could also use like basically any type of Minotaur type model would work well. To begin with, we're going to need to prime our models and build up our Zenithal Undercoat. Strictly speaking, these Bones minis don't need to be primed, but since we're doing an undercoat anyway, we might as well prime them. I first based out the entire model using a dark gray primer, or specifically Vallejo Panzer Gray. I then sprayed from a 45-degree angle above a Steinlerized Gray, which is a mid-tone gray primer. And to finish off the Zenithal Undercoat, I sprayed from above using a white Vallejo primer of some sort, though honestly the specific paints don't matter that much, other than we want to be using a dark gray, a mid-tone gray, and a white. If you're wanting an overall brighter paint job than what I'm going to end up with, you could use a mid-tone instead of the dark gray, a light gray instead of the mid-tone gray, and continue to use a white to get your undercoat. Though you may have to spend a bit of time using a dark wash in the undercoat to define some of the details if you go that route. I have an entire video on undercoating and priming that you can go watch if you need additional details on how to prime your models, which I'll put a card up for now. Since I'm attempting to speed paint these models, this is the end of the undercoating process for me, though if you were wanting to put a bit more time into these models, I would suggest putting it into these undercoat to get your best bang for your time dollar. Specifically, you could use some shades or inks to define the dark recesses a little bit better, and use like a white ink or like dry brushing white to establish the highlights a little bit more. Basically, get a little bit more of a refined paint job. Now that we have our minis undercoated, let's get on to painting them. The first area that we're going to be painting are all the flesh tone areas. To begin with, we're going to be painting all of the exposed skin, so that's the torso, the arms, and the legs where there's no hair. I'm going to be painting the head later using the same fur hair color that we're using other places, since I'm envisioning the head being covered in short fur instead of exposed skin. For the exposed skin, I'm going to be using Guilliman Flesh from Games Workshop. It comes out as the kind of like the shadow tone of a standard Caucasian skin tone. I've mixed a bit of medium into it so that I have a little bit better control on how much coloring is occurring in specific areas. I'm targeting a kind of darker sun-baked look, so I end up applying 2 layers of Guilliman Flesh. After painting the exposed skin, we're going to move on to the fur and hair, which I want to be a nice dark brown. So I'm going to be using Cygor Brown, which is a very dark pigmented rich paint. So I use a lot of medium to thin it down to avoid everything coming out as kind of like a black-brown color. A warmer fur color like Gore-Grunta could also be used here if you're wanting to change things up a little bit. The next area I painted after the fur is the horns on the model. In this case, I painted using Skeleton Horde directly over the Zenithal Undercoat, though often when painting bone and textures and things like that, I'll put a glaze of a warm cream or sand color first. This is just to warm and brighten it up a bit, since Skeleton Horde is basically a sepia wash, but stronger, and it tends to look a little bit desaturated, though honestly I think it turned out pretty well in these models. Since we're painting using 50 Shades of Brown today, the next area I'm going to be painting is the handles of the weapons. For those, I wanted a dark neutral brown since they should read as wood. This I ended up using Wildwood from Games Workshop, which is yet another of their overly pigmented contrast paints, so it needs to be thinned down a bit. The last brown area that we need to apply to these models is all the leathery or ropey bits that we still have remaining. For this, I used Snakebite leather from GW, which is a nice light brown color that can read either as like a lighter leather or a rope, depending on where it is. I did put it on the mask for the Goat Boy originally, but decided later I didn't really like that, so I painted over that. Then I moved on to using a bit of Black Templar, which I used to paint the hooves of the models and some of the hair on the heads coming off of the Goat Boy's belt. Since this is a highly pigmented color, again, I need to use a bit of medium to make sure that there's some gradation in the color when it dries out. The final contrast paint that I'm going to be putting on these models is Blood Angels Red, which is by far my favorite paint in the entire line. It's a nice, warm, slightly orangey red that works really well for many applications. Here I'm just using it as the color for the loincloths, and you could use any other color if you prefer for these loincloths, though I'd probably stay away from yet another shade of brown. For the Goat Boy, who has some heads on his belt, I also used a bit of thin Dark Oath flesh to distinguish it from the Minotaur skin tone and have it be a little bit desaturated, give the suggestion that blood has drained out of them and stuff. Even though we've completed the Ingrise section of the models, we haven't completed the entire model. This is because at the end of the day, there are some materials and textures that I don't think work particularly well for this technique. Specifically things like metallics and some stones I don't think work well, so I tend to use other techniques. And this is like a thing to be aware of, is that Ingrise or sketch style is really good for some things and gets things done very quickly for them, and then for other things it's not necessarily the best, so it allows us to speed up some of our model. For the stone bases, I just based them out using Mountain Stone by Reaper. Once that was dried, I applied some Nuln Oil to darken the recesses, and then after that had dried, I finished them off by stippling in some Wolf Grey by Reaper. This is a simple and effective stone recipe that I go with pretty much all the time when I'm not being particularly fussed about what the base looks like. For the gray metallic areas, I used a combination of Scale 75 paints with the GW wash, but any steel or iron metallic scheme you want to use would work perfectly fine here. So I first based out everything using Thrash Metal by Scale 75, then washed it using Nuln Oil from GW, and then did the final highlighting using Heavy Metal from Scale 75. I didn't want to go too bright with the highlights since I wanted this to have a bit of a patina or weathered look, but I didn't want to go so far as to be doing like a full-on rust effect. For the gold areas, I used a similar Scale 75 plus Nuln Oil setup. So we based out first using Viking Gold from Scale 75. Then I did a wash using Nuln Oil, since it was already on the palette, though a flesh wash like Reekland Flesh Shade would have also worked here perfectly fine, and then did my final highlighting using Dwarven Gold. As you may have noticed on these models, the contrast painted areas are quite shiny here at the end. This is a property of the medium in those paints, which can be resolved by using a matte or satin varnish to knock that shine out to get the finish where you want it to be. I didn't record it, but at some point I did paint the eyes on them using a little bit of red and touch the teeth with a little bone white just to make them pop out. After completing everything, I do highly recommend finishing off these minis with a varnish because the contrast paint, in my experience, wears noticeably more than other paints, so you're going to have bits rub off and fleck. If you're wanting to take these paint jobs a little bit further, doing something more than a basic tabletop standard, adding additional highlights can easily be done using layering or dry brushing techniques. If you are going to be doing dry brushing over contrasted painted areas, I would highly recommend varnishing those areas first to avoid lifting up the paint as you're dry brushing. So that's it for these paint jobs. Hopefully you've got a feel for how the process of using a zenithal undercoat and contrast paints can happen to get a good tabletop quality mini out the door quickly. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give the video a like. If you want to see more content like this, please subscribe to the channel. If there are specific techniques or models that you want to see me paint in the future, feel free to comment them down below. If you're looking for a more material way to support the channel with things like getting captions made and things like that, I do have an account over on Ko-fi that I can accept funds through. And other than that, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.